In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where fog hung over the valleys like old secrets, there sat a farmhouse that had seen almost 100 years pass by. The white paint had peeled away long ago, showing the gray wood underneath. This house held many secrets, just like the layers of old paint that covered its walls. The farm sat alone, far from other houses. A long dirt road wound through the trees for almost 2 miles before reaching the nearest neighbor. When it rained, the road turned to thick mud that stuck to wagon wheels and boots. 2 huge oak trees stood like guards at the edge of the yard. Their wide branches gave shade to the front porch, where Thomas Blackwood would sit each evening with his pipe, watching fireflies blink in the growing darkness. The Blackwood farm was not big or fancy. They had 40 acres of good land, a small patch where they grew tobacco, some corn, and a vegetable garden that Martha Blackwood took care of like it was her church. An old barn housed 2 work horses, 1 milk cow, and a few chickens that pecked around the yard looking for bugs and seeds. It wasn't much, but it belonged to them. Their family had paid for this land with hard work and sweat over many years. The Blackwoods had worked this same land since before the Civil War. They were simple people who measured how rich they were not by money in the bank, but by how much food they had stored away and how healthy their animals were. This is where our strange story begins. In the hot summer of 1923, something happened that would change everything. The Blackwood twins opened their eyes for the first time on April 12th. It had been a very hot day, which was odd for early spring in Kentucky. The dogwood trees were covered with white flowers that stood out bright against the dark green forest. It was like nature itself was marking this day as special, getting ready for something that would make everyone in Creswell County question what they thought they knew about life and death. The midwife's hands shook as she cleaned the newborn babies. She had helped deliver hundreds of babies in Creswell County, but she had never seen anything like this before. Her name was Esther Winters. She was a strong woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen many generations come and go. Everyone knew she was the best midwife in 3 counties. She had brought over 2,000 babies into the world with steady hands and quiet skill. But today, those same hands trembled as she washed the blood away from the tiny bodies. As the warm water cleaned away what was left from birth, she saw something that would be talked about in the county for years to come. Both babies had exactly the same scar on their left shoulder. The scars were shaped like curved moons, about 2 inches long. They were raised and pink, looking more like they had been burned into the skin on purpose rather than being natural birthmarks. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, making the sign of the cross with her wet hand. Her voice, which was usually strong and comforting to new mothers, cracked with worry. "Martha, you need to see this." The small bedroom was thick with the smell of blood and the sweet scent of honeysuckle that grew outside the window. The vines reached toward the glass like curious fingers trying to look inside. One oil lamp cast long shadows on the faded flower wallpaper, making the simple room look like something from another world. Martha Blackwood had been in labor for 18 long hours. She was exhausted. The sheets under her were stained with sweat and blood, showing how hard the birth had been. Her dark hair stuck to her forehead, and her usually healthy face had turned pale as paper. When she saw the marks on her children, what little color was left drained from her face completely. "It can't be possible," she said quietly, her Kentucky accent thick with tiredness and fear. She reached out with a shaking finger to touch one of the marks, as if testing whether it might just be her imagination. "How can they both have the same mark?" Her husband, Thomas Blackwood, was a hard-working farmer with rough hands and a quiet way about him. He stood frozen in the doorway, his face showing confusion and worry. He was a tall man, thin but strong from years of working the land. Deep lines were carved around his eyes from squinting into the sun day after day. His work clothes were still dirty from the fields he had been plowing when a neighbor boy ran to tell him his wife was having the babies. "Maybe it's just a birthmark," the midwife said weakly, though the perfectly matching scars on both babies looked like something far more deliberate than the random patterns nature usually made. "Sometimes babies are born with strange marks that go away with time." "No," Martha said, her voice suddenly firm despite how tired she was. Her hands, rough from years of washing clothes and preserving food, held the babies protectively. "Those aren't birthmarks. Those are scars." The word hung in the air like something you could touch. It challenged everything they understood about how the world worked. Thomas frowned as he stepped closer to look at his sons. His weathered farmer's face showed nothing of what he was thinking. "How can a baby be born with scars?" He asked the practical question of a man who had spent his life dealing with real, solid things. "The seasons came and went in order. If you worked hard, you got results. Scars come from wounds. These boys haven't been wounded." Esther Winters, who had helped 3 generations of Creswell County women have their babies, had no answer. In all her years of delivering babies in farmhouses and fine homes, through war and peace, through sickness and health, she had never seen such a thing. "The ways of the Lord are mysterious," she finally said, falling back on the deep religious faith that had helped her through many difficult births. "These boys are marked for something. Only time will tell what." The oddness of the twins named Elijah and Emmett did not end with their matching scars. As they grew from babies to toddlers, the Blackwoods noticed other strange things. The boys would sometimes speak at exactly the same time, finishing each other's sentences as if they shared one mind. They would wake up at the same moment in the night, crying out the same words that no one could understand. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know. The first incident happened when Elijah was just 2 years old and barely speaking in full sentences. He pointed to an old photograph that Martha kept in a drawer. It showed a stern-looking man in fancy clothes from long ago. It was a family heirloom passed down through her family. "Bad man?" the child said clearly. His small face twisted in fear that seemed too grown up for his years. "He hurts us." Martha had never shown the boys the photograph. She had never talked about the distant relative it showed. Yet there was something in Elijah's eyes as he stared at the picture, a recognition, a memory, that sent a chill down her spine. That same week, Emmett refused to go into the root cellar where Martha stored her preserved food and potatoes. He stood at the top of the steps, rigid with terror, screaming about the dark place where they lock us in. No amount of coaxing or comfort would make him go down the stairs. Elijah, seeing his brother's fear, joined the protest. Both boys wailed about punishment and darkness until Thomas had to carry them away from the cellar door. As the twins grew older, these strange behaviors became more obvious and specific. They spoke of places and people the Blackwoods didn't know, using words and phrases that seemed oddly formal and old-fashioned for children their age. They played games where they pretended to be young gentlemen, having tea or riding horses, copying manners they could not have seen in their rural farming community. By their 3rd birthday, the twins had begun to call themselves by different names sometimes. Jackson and Billy, names the Blackwoods had never used or heard connected to the boys. When asked who Jackson and Billy were, the twins would look confused, as if the question made no sense, then go back to their play as if nothing unusual had happened. Thomas dismissed these oddities as childhood imagination, the special language that twins often developed between themselves. Martha, more sensitive to the uncanny nature of her son's behavior, began to keep a journal recording their strange sayings and actions. She did this partly out of worry as a mother, partly out of a growing sense that something deep and unexplainable was happening to her children, something that went beyond the normal mysteries of childhood. By their 5th birthday, The twins had begun to speak of places they had never been. They described in vivid detail a large house with white columns, servants dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and horses pulling carriages along dirt roads. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent. Each boy added details that completed rather than contradicted what his brother had said. They spoke with the casual familiarity of children describing their own home. In their imaginative play, they would point out where the library or the dining room would be, arguing over the exact color of the parlor curtains. "It was blue, not green," Elijah might correct his brother. "Remember, Mother changed them after the Christmas party when Mrs. Beaumont spilled her wine." And Emmett would pause, thinking, then nod in agreement. "Yes, that's right. Blue like the morning sky." These details were offered not as creative stories, but as remembered facts, casually mentioned like one might talk about what they had for breakfast. The conviction in their young voices as they described this phantom house was unsettling, as if they were recalling actual memories rather than making up tales. They spoke of a woman named Adelaide who wore her hair piled high and dresses that made swishing sounds when she walked. They described her gentle hands and her sad eyes, the way she would sing French songs in the nursery when the Colonel was away. They mentioned a man called Colonel Harland who smelled of tobacco and whiskey and who made people shake when he entered a room, servants and family alike. His boots made a sound on the wooden floors, Emmett would say, demonstrating the precise rhythm by tapping his small fingers on the kitchen table. You could hear him coming from far away. He had a mustache that tickled when he kissed you good night, Elijah would add, wrinkling his nose at the remembered feeling. But only when there were guests to see. Other times, he didn't come to the nursery at all. Martha would listen to these stories with growing unease, not just because of how vivid they were, but because there was something hauntingly familiar about them. The names, the descriptions, they tickled at the edges of her memory like half-forgotten gossip heard in childhood. It was on a trip to town, standing in Whitaker's general store while Thomas argued over the price of a new plow blade, that the pieces suddenly clicked into place for Martha. She overheard two older women discussing the County Historical Society's latest project, the restoration of documents from Willow Creek, the grand plantation that had stood on the eastern edge of the county before the Civil War. They found the Colonel's ledgers, one woman was saying, her voice lowered but still audible in the quiet store. All those poor souls listed like cattle with prices next to their names. William Harland was a cruel man by all accounts, the other replied with a sniff. My grandmother worked in the big house as a girl. She said even his own family walked on eggshells around him. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. Colonel William Harland, the name her boys had been mentioning in their play for months. There had indeed been a Colonel William Harland who owned the largest plantation in the county before the Civil War, some 60 years before the twins were born. And if town gossip and scattered historical records were to be believed, his wife's name had been Adelaide. How could her children know these names? How could they describe a house that had burned to the ground decades before they were born? A cold fear settled in Martha's stomach as she gathered her purchases and hurried the twins out of the store, away from the women's curious glances at her suddenly pale face. That night, after the boys were asleep, she shared her discovery with Thomas. His typical practical nature faltered as she laid out the impossible coincidences, the names, the descriptions, the historical facts that matched their son's pretend games. It doesn't make sense, he said, pacing the worn floorboards of their kitchen. The lamplight threw his shadow, long and distorted, against the wall. How would they know such things? We've never spoken of Willow Creek or its people in this house. Martha's hands twisted in her apron, a nervous habit from childhood. Maybe they heard it in town or from one of the neighbors. But even as she offered the explanation, she knew it wasn't enough. The details the twins shared were too specific, too consistent, too personal to have been picked up from overheard conversations. And there was still the matter of the scars, identical marks that had been present from birth with no natural explanation. "We need to speak with someone about this," Martha finally said. "Someone who might understand what's happening to our boys." Thomas nodded slowly, his face grave in the dim light. "I'll talk to Dr. Pierce when I go to town tomorrow. He's a learned man, educated back east. If anyone might have answers, it would be him." Dr. Samuel Pierce was the one who first suggested documenting the twins' strange recollections. He was a young physician who had returned to his hometown after studying at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Pierce had taken an interest in the new theories about the unconscious mind. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a thoughtful manner, more comfortable among his medical books than at the social gatherings of Creswell County. His decision to return to rural Kentucky after receiving a prestigious education had puzzled many. But Samuel Pierce had his reasons. Chief among them was a deep fascination with the folklore and psychological oddities of mountain communities. When Thomas Blackwood approached him after Sunday services, speaking awkwardly of children who knew things they shouldn't know and scars that appeared without wounds, Dr. Pierce's scientific curiosity was immediately aroused. Instead of dismissing the farmer's concerns as superstition or imagination, he agreed to visit the Blackwood farm and observe the twins himself. "What we're witnessing may be unprecedented in medical literature," he explained to Thomas and Martha one evening in 1928, as they sat in the modest parlor of the Blackwood farmhouse. Outside, the first crickets of evening had begun their chorus, a rhythmic backdrop to the extraordinary conversation taking place within. The twins, now 5 years old, had been put to bed after another day of disturbing revelations. This time about a slave auction they described in such detail that Martha had been moved to tears. The doctor's notebook lay open on his knee, pages already filled with observations and direct quotations from the boys. His fountain pen hovered over the paper as he searched for words to explain the unexplainable to these worried parents. "You mean to say other children don't speak of lives they never lived?" Martha asked, her hands clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her mother's initials, a family heirloom like so much in the farmhouse. The question held both hope and fear, hope that this strangeness might be more common than they realized, fear of what it might mean if it were not. "Not with this level of detail and consistency," Dr. Pierce replied, the lamp on the side table reflecting in his glasses as he adjusted them. "Children often have active imaginations, of course. They create elaborate fantasy worlds, invisible friends. But your sons," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "your sons speak of historical events and people with an accuracy that cannot be attributed to imagination alone, and certainly not with matching physical manifestations like those scars." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The parlor was the least used room in the Blackwood home, reserved for Sunday visitors and special occasions. Its furnishings were sparse but respectable: a horsehair sofa, 2 ladder-back chairs, a small table that had belonged to Martha's grandmother. The Bible occupied a place of honor on a crocheted doily, its leather binding worn from generations of daily readings. "The boys keep asking when they can go home to Willow Creek Plantation," Thomas said, his calloused fingers laced together tightly in his lap. "They say they don't belong here with us." His voice cracked slightly, revealing the emotional toll of hearing his children express such feelings. "They're our children, Doctor, our flesh and blood. We've raised them with love and care. How can they remember a place that's been gone for decades? How can they believe they belong somewhere else?" Dr. Pierce removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully with a handkerchief from his pocket, a habit that gave him time to consider his responses. His medical training had not prepared him for cases like this. No textbook at Johns Hopkins had addressed the possibility of children born with memories of previous lives. The human mind is still largely a mystery to us, he finally said, replacing his glasses and meeting the worried gazes of the parents. There are theories, reincarnation, collective unconscious, even the possibility that memories might somehow be inherited. But nothing in modern science fully explains what your boys are experiencing. It isn't science that's doing this, Martha said quietly, her eyes fixed on the flickering lamp flame. The shadows it cast seemed to dance with a life of their own, much like the impossible knowledge that moved within her sons. People in town are starting to talk. They say the boys are touched. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. In rural Kentucky in 1928, being touched could mean anything from simple eccentricity to divine blessing to demonic influence. It was a word used to explain away the unexplainable, to categorize those who didn't fit neatly into the established order of things. Dr. Pierce nodded sympathetically. Rural Kentucky in 1928 was still a place where superstition held as much sway as science, where old mountain beliefs persisted alongside Methodist hymns. His own grandmother had been what locals called a granny woman, part midwife, part healer, mixing herbal remedies with whispered prayers. He had grown up straddling two worlds, the rational scientific approach of his medical training and the rich tapestry of folk beliefs that colored life in the mountains. "I'd like your permission to document their case," Dr. Pierce said. "Perhaps keep a journal of the things they say, the memories they describe. Could help us understand what's happening. And if the boys are struggling with these recollections, perhaps I can help them process them in a healthy way." Thomas and Martha exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years of partnership. They were simple people. He was a farmer who worked from dawn till dusk tending tobacco and corn. She was a homemaker who kept chickens and tended a vegetable garden that supplied most of their meals. Neither had more than an 8th-grade education, but they loved their strange sons fiercely and wanted to understand what affected them. "If you think it'll help," Thomas finally agreed, his voice gruff with emotion. "We just want our boys to be happy, to know they belong here with us." And so began the systematic documentation of the Blackwood twins and their impossible memories, a process that would eventually draw attention far beyond the boundaries of Creswell County. As spring turned to summer in 1928, the case took an unexpected turn. Dr. Pierce had been visiting the Blackwood farm twice weekly, spending hours with the twins, carefully recording their stories and testing the limits of their knowledge about the past. He had even taken them to the county courthouse to view historical records, watching with scientific fascination and personal unease as the 5-year-old boys navigated the building with the confidence of those who had been there before, pointing out changes in the structure and asking about people long dead as if expecting to find them at their desks. Convinced that he was dealing with something beyond his solo expertise, Dr. Pierce had enlisted the help of his former university colleague, Dr. Eleanor Caldwell, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in America at that time. Her specialty was childhood development, and her recent paper on memory formation in twins had caught Pierce's attention as potentially relevant to the Blackwood case. After weeks of correspondence, she had agreed to travel to Kentucky to observe the twins herself, drawn by both professional curiosity and personal friendship with her former classmate. Dr. Caldwell was a pioneer in many ways, not only as a woman in medicine, but as a researcher willing to explore the boundaries between scientific orthodoxy and more unusual psychological phenomena. She arrived in Creswell County on a sweltering June day, stepping off the train in a smart linen suit that immediately marked her as an outsider. Her dark hair was cut in a fashionable bob, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to navigating male-dominated professional spaces. The station master and several loiterers on the platform stared openly at this unusual arrival, a well-dressed woman traveling alone, carrying a leather medical bag similar to Dr. Pierce's. "Are you certain about this, Samuel?" she asked as Dr. Pierce drove her in his Model T Ford along the dusty roads leading to the Blackwood farm. Fields of young tobacco and corn stretched out on either side, the crops still vibrantly green in the early summer heat. Past life memories in children aren't unheard of, but simultaneous occurrence in twins, complete with matching physical evidence. Her voice trailed off as she wiped perspiration from her brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. The Kentucky humidity was a stark contrast to the more temperate Baltimore climate she was accustomed to. "I've documented everything meticulously," Dr. Pierce assured her, navigating around a rut in the road. The Model T bounced and rattled, its mechanical coughs punctuating their conversation. "These boys know things they couldn't possibly know, details about a time long before they were born, about people who died decades ago. And there's a consistency to their accounts that defies explanation as mere fantasy." He glanced sideways at his colleague, noting the skepticism in her expression. "I know how it sounds, Eleanor. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But something extraordinary is happening with these children, something that challenges everything we were taught about the nature of consciousness and memory." "And the parents?" she inquired. "What's their perspective on all this?" "They're frightened," Pierce admitted. "Confused. They're simple country people, hard-working, God-fearing. This goes against everything in their understanding of the world. But they love their sons and want to help them however they can." Dr. Caldwell remained skeptical until she met the twins herself. They were playing in the yard when the doctors arrived, two identical boys with copper-colored hair and serious eyes that seemed too old for their young faces. They were engaged in some game involving sticks arranged in a precise pattern on the ground, a game that Dr. Pierce would later explain mimicked the layout of Willow Creek Plantation according to historical maps. The boys stopped their play and stared at Dr. Caldwell with unsettling intensity as she emerged from the automobile. Their expressions were not those of children seeing a stranger, but rather of individuals recognizing someone familiar yet unexpected. "You're wearing Adelaide's dress," Elijah said, pointing to Dr. Caldwell's light blue suit. There was no childish hesitation in his voice, only matter-of-fact certainty. "She wore that the day of the picnic," Emmett added, his eyes fixed on the garment with an expression of recognition. "Before the bad thing happened." Dr. Caldwell felt a chill despite the summer heat, the hairs on her arms rising beneath her sleeves. She had indeed chosen a light blue outfit that morning, though her suit was of a modern cut that no woman in the 1860s would have worn. The coincidence, if it was coincidence, was unnerving. "What bad thing happened at the picnic?" she asked gently, kneeling to meet the boys at eye level. Her medical training automatically engaged as she studied their facial expressions, their body language, looking for signs of coaching or deception. She found none, only the direct, unflinching gaze of children stating what they believed to be simple truth. The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Dr. Caldwell, despite her expertise in child psychology, could not interpret. It was as if an entire conversation had taken place in that momentary look. "We're not supposed to talk about it," they said in unison, their voices blending in perfect synchronization. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they returned to their game, their attention completely diverted from the newcomer who had so intrigued them moments before. Dr. Pierce gave his colleague a significant look. "You see what I mean?" he murmured, leading her toward the farmhouse where Thomas and Martha waited on the porch. "It's not just what they say, but how they say it. No hesitation, no elaboration or contradiction if questioned further, just simple statements of what they perceive as fact." Dr. Caldwell nodded slowly, her scientific skepticism beginning to waver in the face of direct observation. "Remarkable," she admitted. Though of course we must rule out other explanations before jumping to extraordinary conclusions. Of course, Dr. Pierce agreed. That's why I asked you here. I need another trained perspective, someone who won't be swayed by local superstitions or my own potential biases. That night, after the children were asleep, the doctors sat with the Blackwoods at their kitchen table. A kerosene lamp cast long shadows as they spoke in hushed tones, careful not to wake the twins, who slept in a small bedroom just off the main living area. The kitchen was the heart of the Blackwood home, a warm, practical space with a large wood stove, worn but scrubbed clean wooden counters, and bunches of drying herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. It smelled of the evening's cornbread and beans, of lye soap, and the tobacco that Thomas occasionally smoked in his pipe. There was indeed a picnic at Willow Creek Plantation in July of 1863, Dr. Pierce explained, consulting his notes, the pages now dog-eared from frequent reference. I found references to it in the county historical records. It was a grand affair from all accounts, meant to boost morale during the war. The local Confederate officers were all in attendance, along with the prominent families of the area. It was the last social event held there before the plantation fell into financial ruin after the war. He spread out several yellowed newspaper clippings on the table photocopies he had made from the Historical Society's archives. One showed a formal announcement of the event, another a brief society column mentioning its success. But what bad thing were the boys referring to? Dr. Caldwell wondered, examining the clippings with a scholar's attention to detail. These accounts mention nothing unusual. There's nothing in the official record, Dr. Pierce admitted, removing his glasses and massaging the bridge of his nose, where red marks showed the long hours he'd spent poring over documents. But I spoke with Agatha Simmons at the Historical Society. She's in her 80s now, but her mother worked as a house servant at Willow Creek. According to family stories passed down, there was some kind of tragedy that day, something the family hushed up. What kind of tragedy? Thomas asked, leaning forward, his elbows on the worn oilcloth that covered the table. Dr. Pierce hesitated. Mrs. Simmons wasn't entirely clear. Her mother never spoke directly about it, said it wasn't something decent folks discussed. But she implied it had something to do with the colonel's sons, that they'd done something to displease him severely, and he'd punished them. The exact nature of the transgression or the punishment wasn't specified. Martha Blackwood shivered, though the summer night was warm. The boys have nightmares about fire, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking of it might summon the terror that plagued her son's sleep. They wake up screaming, saying their backs are burning. The scars, Dr. Caldwell murmured, making a note in her own journal. The clinical detachment of her tone belied the growing unease she felt. What had begun as scientific curiosity was evolving into something more disturbing, a mystery with potentially dark implications. Thomas nodded grimly. They say he did it to punish them, that he caught them trying to run away. Colonel Harland? Dr. Pierce asked, though he already suspected the answer. They never say his name when they talk about the fire, Martha said, twisting a loose thread from her apron around her finger. Just him or he, like they're scared to speak his name even now. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Outside, an owl called, its mournful hooting seeming to emphasize the gravity of their discussion. The lamp flame flickered as a night breeze found its way through the window screen, carrying with it the sweet scent of honeysuckle and the earthy smell of the surrounding farmland. Dr. Caldwell made a note in her journal, her precise handwriting filling another page with observations and questions. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from scientific interest to compassionate concern. I'd like to try something called regression therapy with the boys, she suggested. It's a relatively new technique where we guide them into a relaxed state and then ask them questions about these memories. It might help us understand what they're experiencing and possibly help them process these disturbing recollections. Thomas looked uncertain, his weathered face creased with worry. It won't harm them? Not at all, Dr. Caldwell assured him, her voice gentle but confident. Think of it as guided conversation. They remain conscious and aware throughout. It's simply a way of helping them access these memories in a safe, controlled environment. Martha twisted her apron in her hands, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. Will it make the memories stop? She asked, the desperate hope of a mother evident in her voice. Will they finally be just normal boys? Dr. Caldwell hesitated, unwilling to offer false hope. I can't promise that, she said honestly. These memories, whatever their source, seem deeply ingrained. But understanding is the first step toward healing. If we can help the boys make sense of what they're experiencing, it might reduce their distress. Thomas and Martha exchanged glances again, that silent communication that had sustained them through hardships and joys alike. Finally, Thomas nodded. When do you want to do this? Tomorrow, if possible, Dr. Caldwell replied. While the experiences they mentioned today are still fresh, and so it was decided. As the adults continued their discussion, mapping out a plan for the following day, none of them noticed the small shadows that briefly appeared and then vanished from the darkened doorway of the twins' bedroom, or the whispered exchange between two identical voices, too quiet for adult ears to detect. I want you boys to close your eyes and take deep breaths, Dr. Caldwell instructed gently. Imagine you're floating on a cloud, completely safe and relaxed. The twins complied, their identical faces growing serene. Now, I want you to think back to Willow Creek Plantation. Can you tell me your names when you lived there? Without opening their eyes, both boys responded. Jackson. Both of you were named Jackson? Dr. Pierce asked, puzzled. No, Elijah said. I'm Jackson. I'm William, Emmett added. But everyone calls me Billy. And how old are you? Dr. Caldwell continued. 12, they answered in unison. And what year is it, Jackson and Billy? 1863, they replied together. Dr. Caldwell exchanged glances with Dr. Pierce. Can you tell us about your parents? A shadow passed over Elijah's face. Mama died when we were born. Father doesn't like to talk about her, Emmett continued. He says we killed her by coming into the world. And your father is Colonel Harland? Dr. Pierce asked. Both boys flinched visibly at the name. He's not our real father, Elijah whispered. What do you mean? Dr. Caldwell pressed gently. We heard the servants talking, Emmett explained, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur. They say our real father was a slave named Samuel who worked in the stables. They say our mother loved him, but the colonel found out. He had Samuel whipped to death, Elijah continued, a tear sliding down his cheek. And then he married our mother to hide her shame. But he hates us because we're not his blood. Martha stifled a gasp, and Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Is that why you wanted to run away? Dr. Caldwell asked. Because the colonel was cruel to you? Both boys nodded, their eyes still closed, but their faces contorted with remembered fear. We were going to find the Union soldiers, Emmett said. We heard they were camped just 20 miles north. We thought they might help us. But he caught us, Elijah continued, his breathing becoming rapid. He found the map we'd drawn. He was so angry. What did he do when he caught you? Dr. Pierce asked softly. Both boys' hands moved simultaneously to their left shoulders, touching the crescent-shaped scars through their cotton shirts. He heated his cavalry saber in the fire, Emmett whispered. Said he was marking us so we'd never forget who we belonged to. Said if we ever tried to run again, he'd do worse, Elijah added, trembling now. Martha was openly weeping, while Thomas's face had hardened into a mask of barely contained rage at the thought of such cruelty, even if it had happened to other boys in another time. What happened after that? Dr. Caldwell asked, her own voice unsteady. We never got another chance to escape, Emmett said. The war came to us instead. Soldiers in blue coats arrived one day. There was fighting, Elijah continued. The house caught fire, Emmett added, his voice rising with remembered panic. We were locked in our room. The colonel wouldn't let us out. He said if the Yankees wanted the plantation, they could have our bodies too. The smoke, Elijah cried, now shaking violently. Can't breathe. Can't. Both boys gasped simultaneously. Dr. Caldwell quickly ended the session, guiding the twins back to full awareness. They blinked in confusion, looking around the parlor as if surprised to find themselves there. You did very well, she assured them, offering each boy a peppermint from her purse. Why don't you go play outside for a bit while we talk to your parents? After the twins had left, an uneasy silence filled the room. Those poor children, Martha finally said, wiping her eyes. To die so horribly, locked in a burning room. If any of this is true, Thomas reminded her, though his voice lacked conviction. The story had affected him deeply, truth or imagination. That's what we need to determine, Dr. Pierce said. I'll check the historical records for any mention of twin boys who died in a fire at Willow Creek. And the scars? Dr. Caldwell asked. How do you explain those? No one had an answer. The following days brought a flurry of research. Dr. Pierce spent hours at the county courthouse and historical society, piecing together the history of Willow Creek Plantation. The courthouse was a stately brick building in the center of town, its halls echoing with the footsteps of clerks and lawyers, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and furniture polish. The Historical Society occupied a former residence on Elm Street, a Victorian house filled with artifacts and documents from the county's past. While Dr. Caldwell conducted additional sessions with the twins, gentler explorations that avoided the traumatic memories of fire and death, Dr. Pierce buried himself in land records, birth and death certificates, newspaper archives, and personal accounts collected by the Historical Society. He worked with the fervor of a man who sensed he was on the verge of an extraordinary discovery, one that might challenge everything he thought he knew about the human mind and spirit. What he discovered seemed to confirm at least parts of the twins' story. Colonel William Harland had indeed married a young woman named Adelaide in 1850. Her maiden name was Beaumont, daughter of another plantation owner whose property adjoined Willow Creek. The marriage seemed to have been arranged to consolidate landholdings rather than for romantic reasons, a common practice among the landed gentry of the time. Adelaide had given birth to twin boys in 1851 and died shortly after from childbed fever. The boys were registered as Jackson and William Harlan Jr. Their birth date, as recorded in the family Bible now preserved at the Historical Society, was April 12th, the same birthday as Elijah and Emmett Blackwood. The plantation records made no mention of a slave named Samuel, but this wasn't surprising. Such relationships would have been kept secret, especially if they involved the lady of the house. However, Dr. Pierce did find an entry in the plantation's punishment ledger, noting that a field hand named Samuel had been publicly whipped for gross insubordination in 1850, several months before Adelaide's marriage to the colonel. The man had died from his injuries, the cause of death clinically recorded as excessive blood loss following disciplinary action. In a box of unsorted documents, Dr. Pierce found a folded paper that proved particularly illuminating. A letter from Adelaide's personal maid to her sister, smuggled out of the plantation and preserved by the recipient's family. The letter, dated just a month before Adelaide's marriage, mentioned her mistress's delicate condition and fears for the child of her secret union. The maid expressed concern that the arranged marriage was being rushed to hide Adelaide's pregnancy and that Colonel Harland, while publicly presenting the match as advantageous, privately raged about being forced to legitimize a slave's bastard. Most significantly, Dr. Pierce found a brief newspaper account from August 1863 reporting that Willow Creek Plantation had burned to the ground during a skirmish between Confederate and Union forces. The article mentioned that the colonel had perished in the fire along with 2 young dependents of the household. Their names were not given, and no further details about the circumstances were provided. The official cause of the fire was listed as military action, though no specific culpability was assigned to either Union or Confederate forces. A separate notice in the same newspaper, placed by the executor of the colonel's estate, sought information about any surviving relatives who might have claim to what remained of the Harland fortune. No such relatives ever came forward, and the land was eventually sold at auction to cover outstanding debts. When Dr. Pierce shared these findings with Dr. Caldwell and the Blackwoods, gathered once again around the kitchen table, the implications were impossible to ignore. The historical record seems to validate their story, Dr. Pierce concluded, arranging his notes and photocopies in a neat stack. The names, dates, and events they described match what I've been able to verify through independent sources. But that still doesn't explain how Elijah and Emmett could know these details, Thomas objected, his practical farmer's mind struggling with the supernatural implications, or why they bear those scars. Dr. Caldwell had been silent as Dr. Pierce presented his findings, her scientifically trained mind wrestling with the evidence before her. Now she spoke, her voice measured but tinged with wonder. "There's one more place we need to check," Dr. Pierce said gravely. "The old Willow Creek Cemetery. If Jackson and Billy Harland are buried there, perhaps their gravestones will tell us more." Martha crossed herself instinctively at the mention of graves. "You want to take the boys there?" she asked, alarmed at the thought of her sons confronting physical evidence of their supposed past lives. "No," Dr. Pierce assured her quickly. "Dr. Caldwell and I will go alone. The boys have been through enough already. But if we're to understand what's happening, we need to gather all the evidence we can." The next morning dawned overcast, the summer sky heavy with the promise of rain. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Caldwell set out early, following directions provided by the Historical Society to the site of the former plantation. Little remained of Willow Creek's grandeur, just the crumbling foundation stones of the main house, half hidden by decades of vegetation, and a few outbuildings that had escaped the fire but fallen into disrepair over the years. The cemetery was located on what had once been plantation grounds, now overgrown with weeds and surrounded by forest that had reclaimed much of the formerly cultivated land. A rusted iron fence, listing at angles where the posts had given way, marked the boundary of the sacred ground. The gate hung from a single hinge, its latch long since broken. Many of the graves were in disrepair, headstones tilted or broken, engravings faded by decades of weather. Some bore only simple markers, fieldstones with no names or dates, presumably the final resting places of slaves who had worked the plantation. Others displayed more elaborate monuments marking the graves of the white landowners and their families. It took them nearly an hour of searching before they found what they were looking for: a small plot enclosed by a rusted iron fence within the larger cemetery. Inside stood 3 gravestones, one large marble monument for Colonel William Harland, 1815 to 1863, its once imposing presence now diminished by a crack running through the stone. A smaller but elegant stone for Adelaide Harland, 1830 to 1851, carved with lilies and bearing the inscription "Beloved Wife and Mother, too soon called to glory," and a single shared marker for the twins. Dr. Pierce brushed away the lichen to reveal the inscription: Jackson and William Harlan Jr., born April 12, 1851, died August 17, 1863. Together in life, together in death. April 12th, Dr. Caldwell murmured, the significance not lost on her. That's the same birthday as Elijah and Emmett. And they died at the same age our twins are now, Dr. Pierce noted grimly. 12 years old. They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications. The cemetery was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. The air smelled of damp earth and the wild honeysuckle that grew in tangles along the fence. Samuel isn't buried here, Dr. Caldwell observed, scanning the nearby markers. At least not with a proper headstone. Slaves were typically buried in unmarked graves, Dr. Pierce reminded her, often outside the main cemetery. If the colonel had him whipped to death for involvement with Adelaide, he certainly wouldn't have honored him with a marked grave. As they stood contemplating this discovery, they heard a rustling in the undergrowth behind them. Turning, they were startled to find both Blackwood twins watching them from the edge of the cemetery. They stood perfectly still, identical figures in matching overalls, their copper hair catching the sparse sunlight that filtered through the clouds. "How did you boys get here?" Dr. Pierce demanded, shock making his voice sharper than intended. The cemetery was over 3 miles from the Blackwood farm, along roads and paths that would be difficult for young children to navigate alone. "We knew the way," Elijah said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the overgrown graves. "We've always known," Emmett added, as if this explained everything. "Did you follow us?" Dr. Caldwell asked, moving toward them with concern. The woods surrounding the old plantation were no place for children to wander alone. There were sinkholes, abandoned wells, and other hazards that local adults knew to avoid. The twins shook their heads in unison, a synchronized movement that was both natural and somehow unsettling. "We came to visit Mother," Elijah explained, pointing to Adelaide's grave with a familiarity that sent a chill down Dr. Caldwell's spine. "We used to bring her wildflowers every Sunday after church," Emmett continued, his young voice solemn. "The colonel made us, even though we never knew her," Elijah added. Dr. Pierce swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his scientific detachment in the face of this uncanny scenario. "Boys, how did your parents allow you to come all this way by yourselves?" The twins exchanged a glance before Elijah responded. "They think we're playing by the creek near the house. We'll be back before they miss us." The doctors exchanged alarmed glances. They hadn't told the twins about their discoveries or mentioned the cemetery visit. There was no logical way the boys could have known where to find them this morning. "Boys," Dr. Pierce said carefully, "how did you know we'd be here today?" "We didn't," they replied together, their voices blending in that perfect unison that never failed to unsettle adults. Then Elijah added, "We come here sometimes when no one's watching." "Your parents know you wander this far from home?" Dr. Caldwell asked, concerned both about the physical dangers and the psychological implications of the twins secretly visiting the graves of their supposed past selves. The twins looked at each other, then back at the doctors with unsettling directness. Their eyes, an identical shade of hazel, seemed older than their years as they regarded the adults with something like pity. "They're not our real parents," Emmett said, the simple statement carrying a weight of meaning that hung in the air between them. "We know that now," Elijah continued. "We remembered everything after you made us sleep yesterday." A chill ran down Dr. Pierce's spine despite the summer heat. "What do you mean, everything?" "How we died," they said in unison, their young voices oddly flat, devoid of the emotion such a statement should carry. "How the fire felt. How we screamed until we couldn't anymore." Dr. Caldwell took a step toward them, professional detachment warring with human compassion. Her training told her to maintain objective distance, but her heart responded to the children before her, regardless of whether their memories were genuine past lives or some extraordinary psychological phenomenon. "That must have been very frightening to remember," she said gently, kneeling on the damp ground to bring herself to their eye level. "We're not scared anymore," Emmett said, his expression eerily calm. "We're angry," Elijah finished, a flash of something dark and adult passing across his childish features. As if on cue, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the tree branches and stirring up dust from the parched summer ground. A few fat raindrops began to fall, precursors to the storm that had been threatening all morning. "I think we should get you home now," Dr. Pierce said firmly, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The scientific part of him wanted to continue questioning the twins, to probe the extent of their memories and the nature of their anger. But the human part, the part that saw two young boys standing among graves in a gathering storm, knew it was time to return them to the safety and normalcy of the Blackwood farm. "They're not," Emmett began. "Our real parents," Elijah finished. "But we'll go back." The twins turned and started walking with purpose toward the cemetery gate, leaving the stunned doctors to follow. By the time they reached Dr. Pierce's Model T, parked on what had once been the plantation's main drive, the rain was falling steadily. The drive back to the Blackwood farm was conducted mostly in silence, the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers punctuating the awkward quiet. The twins sat in the back seat, whispering occasionally to each other in voices too low for the adults to hear. Dr. Caldwell attempted several times to engage them in conversation but received only monosyllabic responses or polite silence. As they approached the farm, Dr. Pierce finally broke the uneasy quiet. "Boys, we won't tell your parents you went to the cemetery if you promise not to wander off like that again. It's dangerous for children your age to be out alone, especially so far from home." The twins regarded him with identical expressions of mild amusement, as if his concern was misplaced but appreciated nonetheless. "We promise," they said together, though something in their tone suggested the promise might be contingent on circumstances the adults couldn't foresee. Martha was waiting on the porch as they pulled up, her face creased with worry. "Where on earth have you been?" she cried, rushing down the steps as the twins climbed from the automobile. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "They were with us, Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Caldwell explained smoothly, deciding in that moment to protect the boys from their mother's justified anger. "They expressed interest in our research, and we thought a short drive might be educational." Martha's relief was evident, though she cast a suspicious glance at her sons, who maintained expressions of perfect innocence. "Well, you might have left a note," she scolded the doctors mildly. "I was about to send Thomas searching, and him with plowing to finish before the rain gets too heavy." "Our apologies," Dr. Pierce said sincerely. "It was thoughtless of us." As Martha ushered everyone inside out of the increasingly heavy rain, Dr. Caldwell placed a restraining hand on Dr. Pierce's arm, holding him back on the porch for a moment. "We need to discuss what happened at the cemetery," she said quietly, "and what it might mean." Dr. Pierce nodded grimly. "Tonight, after the children are asleep. I think we've reached a critical point in this case, Eleanor. Something is happening that goes beyond psychological curiosity or scientific anomaly." "I know," she agreed, her expression troubled. "I've maintained my skepticism until now, searching for rational explanations. But after today," she glanced through the window at the twins, now helping Martha set the table for lunch, the picture of normal, helpful children. "I'm beginning to think we're dealing with something beyond the reach of our current scientific understanding." Dr. Pierce adjusted his rain-spattered spectacles, his expression a mixture of academic excitement and human concern. The question now is what to do about it. How do we help these children, regardless of who or what they might have been in a previous existence? It was a question that would continue to haunt them both as the day progressed toward evening, and the gathering storm clouds mirrored the darkness that seemed to be closing in around the Blackwood farm. That night, a summer storm rolled across Creswell County, bringing much-needed rain but also violent lightning and window-rattling thunder. The Blackwood farmhouse, normally snug against the elements, seemed to creak and shift with each gust of wind, as if the old structure itself was uneasy. Dinner had been a subdued affair. Thomas, exhausted from racing to finish his plowing before the heaviest rain arrived, had little energy for conversation. The twins were unusually quiet as well, responding to questions with brief answers or silent nods. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Caldwell exchanged theories in hushed tones, their scientific dialogue punctuated by rumbles of thunder that seemed to underscore the gravity of their discussion. Martha moved between stove and table with practiced efficiency, serving her homemade bread and chicken stew, but her usual cheerful demeanor was dampened by worry. She had noticed the change in her sons since the regression session, a new remoteness, as if part of them was elsewhere. Several times during the meal, she caught them staring into space with identical vacant expressions, only to snap back to awareness simultaneously when addressed. After the dishes were cleared and the twins had been sent to bed with strict instructions to stay there, the adults gathered in the kitchen for a council of sorts. The rain beat a steady rhythm on the tin roof, occasionally overwhelmed by crashes of thunder that rattled the windows in their frames. Lightning flashes illuminated the yard in brief, stark tableaus, throwing strange shadows across the kitchen floor. "We believe what the boys are experiencing goes beyond mere fantasy or suggestion," Dr. Pierce explained carefully, keeping his voice low despite the storm's noise that would surely mask their conversation from young ears. He sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open before him, pages filled with observations, historical facts, and increasingly complex theories. "What are you saying?" Thomas demanded, his patience wearing thin after days of scientific observations and theories that did nothing to explain why his sons believed they were someone else's children. He stood by the stove, stoking the fire against the unusual chill the storm had brought, his movements betraying his agitation. Dr. Caldwell stepped in, her tone measured. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, we believe your sons may be experiencing what some call reincarnation, the rebirth of souls from a previous life." Martha crossed herself instinctively, the gesture automatic for a woman raised in the strict Methodist traditions of rural Kentucky. "That's not Christian teaching, Doctor." "Perhaps not in the Methodist Church," Dr. Caldwell acknowledged, understanding the theological challenge her suggestion presented to the devout couple. "But many faiths around the world accept this concept. Hinduism, Buddhism, certain Native American spiritual traditions all incorporate some version of soul rebirth in their belief systems." "We're God-fearing Christians," Thomas said firmly, though without hostility. "We don't hold with such notions." "I understand," Dr. Caldwell replied gently. "But regardless of what we call it or how we explain it within our various belief systems, the evidence suggests that your sons have somehow retained memories from these other boys who lived and died 65 years ago. And it would explain the matching scars, the shared memories, the knowledge of historical details they couldn't have learned through normal means." Thomas shook his head stubbornly, the movement illuminated by another flash of lightning that cast his face in stark relief, emphasizing the deep furrows of concern on his brow. "Those boys are our flesh and blood, born of my wife's body. I was there. I saw it. No one's disputing their physical birth to you," Dr. Pierce assured him, recognizing the father's need to claim his sons against this strange intrusion from the past. "But their souls, their memories, those might have come from elsewhere. What does this mean for them?" Martha asked, her voice small amid another roll of thunder. She sat at the table, hands clasped tightly before her as if in prayer. Will they ever be normal boys? Will they always believe they're these Harlan twins? Before either doctor could respond, the back door banged open, blown by a strong gust of wind that sent rain spattering across the kitchen floor. The sudden intrusion startled them all, a physical punctuation to their supernatural discussion. "I'd better secure that," Thomas said, rising to close the door. As he moved across the kitchen, he glanced out into the storm-tossed yard and froze, one hand extended toward the door latch. "Someone's out there," he announced, his voice tense as he stepped back and reached for his shotgun that hung above the door. The weapon was a practical necessity for farm life, used for hunting and occasionally for scaring off predators that threatened the livestock. Dr. Pierce joined him, peering through the rain-streaked window into the darkness beyond. The yard was barely visible, a landscape of shifting shadows and rain-bent vegetation, illuminated only intermittently by lightning. "Probably just a traveler caught in the storm," he suggested, though something in Thomas's reaction made him doubt his own explanation. "No traveler comes this far off the main road," Thomas replied grimly, checking that the shotgun was loaded. "And no one travels in weather like this." As they watched, lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the scene outside. The momentary brightness revealed a figure standing at the edge of the property where the yard gave way to fields. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned military uniform. He stood perfectly still despite the raging storm, facing the house with an intensity that seemed palpable even at a distance. "Dear God," Dr. Pierce whispered, instinctively stepping back from the window. "He looks like—" Another lightning flash, brighter than before, and the figure was gone, as if he had never been there at all. "Like who?" Thomas demanded, his knuckles white around the shotgun barrel. Dr. Pierce turned to him with a pale face, his scientific certainty shaken by what he had glimpsed in that brief illumination. "Like the portrait of Colonel Harlan that hangs in the county courthouse." Martha gasped, and Dr. Caldwell quickly moved to comfort her, placing a steadying hand on the older woman's shoulder. The kitchen seemed suddenly colder, as if the storm had found its way inside despite the closed windows and blazing stove. "It's just the storm playing tricks on our eyes," she assured them, though her scientific mind struggled to explain what she'd glimpsed in the lightning flash. "Our conversation has us all thinking about the past." A sudden scream from upstairs shattered the moment, high-pitched and terrified, the sound rising above the storm's fury with an urgency that sent all four adults rushing toward the stairs. It was the twins, their voices blended in shared terror. "The boys!" Martha cried, already halfway up the narrow staircase with Thomas close behind, taking the steps two at a time. They found the twins standing by their bedroom window, pointing into the stormy night. They wore their white cotton nightshirts, their hair tousled from sleep, but their eyes were wide and fully alert with fear. "He's here," they said in unison, their small faces tight with terror. "He's come for us." Thomas pulled them away from the window, gathering one boy in each strong arm. "There's nobody out there, boys. Just the storm." "You don't understand," Elijah insisted, struggling against his father's protective embrace. "He followed us back. Just like we did," Emmett added, his eyes fixed on the window as if he could still see something beyond the rain-streaked glass. Martha knelt beside them, gathering both into her arms once Thomas released them. Her face was pale but determined, maternal protection overriding her own fear. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Your father and I won't let anyone take you." The twins looked at her with sad, knowing eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond their years. In the flickering lamplight, their faces appeared almost adult in their solemn understanding. "You can't stop him," they said together, their voices eerily synchronized despite the emotion that should have disrupted such perfect timing. "Nobody could last time either." As if punctuating their words, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, seeming to vibrate through the very foundations. Simultaneously, all the lamps flickered and died, plunging them into sudden, complete darkness. For a moment, no one moved, frozen by the unexpected blackout and the twins' ominous words. The darkness was absolute except for occasional lightning flashes through the window, which cast bizarre, elongated shadows across the bedroom walls. Dr. Pierce fumbled for the matches he kept in his pocket, striking one to light the kerosene lamp on the bedside table. The small flame caught, spreading a circle of wavering light that did little to dispel the oppressive darkness, but at least allowed them to see each other's faces. In the small circle of wavering light, the twins' faces looked ghostly, their eyes large and filled with a knowledge no child should possess. They stood together now, holding hands, a unit unto themselves despite the adults surrounding them. "We need to leave," they said with quiet urgency. "All of us. Now." "Don't be ridiculous," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. The atmosphere in the room had changed, charged with a tension that went beyond the natural apprehension caused by the storm. "We're not going anywhere in this weather." "He'll burn the house," Elijah warned, his young voice steady despite the terrifying prediction. "With us inside," Emmett added, "just like before." Dr. Caldwell intervened, her scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable strangeness of the situation. "Boys, fear can make our imaginations very powerful. What you're sensing might just be the storm combined with the memories we've been discussing." She was interrupted by another crash, this one not thunder, but the sound of breaking glass from downstairs, followed by the distinctive creak of the front door opening. The noise was unmistakable even over the storm, the sound of someone entering the house. "Someone's in the house?" Dr. Pierce whispered, his academic detachment giving way to very human fear. Thomas raised his shotgun, his farmer's practicality reasserting itself in the face of a tangible threat. "Stay here with the boys," he instructed Martha, his voice low but commanding. "Doctors, you stay too." He moved toward the bedroom door, his posture tense but determined. "Don't go down there alone," Martha pleaded, clutching at his sleeve. "I'll come with you," Dr. Pierce offered, looking around for something to serve as a weapon. He picked up a heavy brass candlestick from the dresser, feeling somewhat foolish but unwilling to let Thomas face an intruder alone. "Be careful," Dr. Caldwell warned, positioning herself protectively near the twins and Martha. The men crept down the stairs, straining to hear over the noise of the storm. The lower floor was pitch black, the only illumination coming from occasional lightning flashes through the windows that briefly transformed the familiar rooms into landscapes of stark light and impenetrable shadow. "Check the kitchen," Thomas whispered, gesturing with his shotgun. "I'll look in the parlor." They separated, moving cautiously through the familiar rooms turned strange by darkness and apprehension. Dr. Pierce had just reached the kitchen when he heard Thomas cry out in alarm. "Samuel, get in here." The use of his first name, unusual for the formal farmer, conveyed the urgency of the situation. Dr. Pierce rushed to the parlor to find Thomas standing frozen, staring at the far wall. In the next lightning flash, Dr. Pierce saw what had shocked him. Written on the wallpaper in what looked like charcoal or ash were the words, "They belong to me." The handwriting was elegant but angry, the letters pressed so hard into the wallpaper that they had torn through in places. It was not the work of a child's hand, nor did it match the penmanship of anyone in the household. "The boys?" Thomas gasped, already turning back toward the stairs, his face ashen in the brief illumination. "We need to get back to the boys." They raced back to the bedroom, taking the steps 2 at a time, only to find the door locked from the inside. There was no key in the lock. The simple farmer's house had few such security measures, which meant the door had been barricaded from within. "Martha!" Thomas shouted, pounding on the wood with his free hand, the other still gripping the shotgun. "Open the door!" No response came, though they could hear movement inside, shuffling footsteps, a muffled voice that didn't sound like Martha or Dr. Caldwell, and what might have been weeping. Thomas stepped back and then rammed his shoulder against the door. It held firm, suggesting something heavy had been pushed against it. He tried again with the same result, his face contorting with the pain of impact but his determination undaunted. "The hinges," Dr. Pierce suggested frantically, examining the door frame by the light of another lightning flash. "If we can remove them." Before they could act, a scream came from inside the room. Not the children this time, but Martha. A sound of pure terror that galvanized Thomas into desperate action. Thomas aimed his shotgun at the hinges and fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the hallway, momentarily drowning out even the storm's fury. Wood splintered, and the upper hinge gave way. A second shot, hastily aimed at the lower hinge, weakened the door enough for the men to break through with their combined weight. The scene inside froze them in their tracks. The bedroom was transformed. The simple furnishings, a dresser, the twins' bed, a small chair, had been pushed against the walls. Martha was pressed against the far corner, her face a mask of horror, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle further screams. Dr. Caldwell stood protectively in front of the twins, who were huddled together on their bed, their small forms almost lost in the shadows. And between them, illuminated by a strange flickering light that seemed to emanate from no visible source, stood a tall figure in a Confederate officer's uniform. His back was to the door, but at the sound of the shotgun blast, he turned slowly to face the newcomers. The man, if he could be called that, was tall and broad-shouldered with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate, the gray wool unmarked by the rain that still beat against the windows, the brass buttons gleaming in the unnatural light. His face was handsome in a harsh way, with a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray, and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire, literally burn, with tiny flames visible in the depths of the pupils. "Get away from my boys," Thomas growled, raising his shotgun to aim at the intruder's chest. His voice was steady despite the impossible nature of what he was facing. The figure turned slowly to face him, regarding the weapon with evident disdain. In the dim light, they could see his features were handsome but cruel, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. "Your boys?" the figure asked, his voice cultured but laced with contempt. His accent was the refined drawl of old Southern aristocracy, not the rural Kentucky speech of the region's current inhabitants. "These are my sons, and they've been very disobedient." "Colonel Harland," Dr. Pierce breathed, his scientific mind rebelling against what his eyes were seeing. This was no look-alike, no hallucination brought on by suggestion and stress. The man before them was exactly as depicted in the courthouse portrait, down to the small scar above his right eyebrow. The figure inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the introduction, a gesture of formal courtesy at odds with the menace that radiated from him. "Dr. Pierce, I presume. You've been filling my sons' heads with nonsense about rebirth and new lives. There is no escape from one's true nature, or one's true father." Thomas fired the shotgun without warning, unable to tolerate the threat to his children any longer. The blast should have torn through the intruder at such close range, but the figure merely flickered like a candle flame in a breeze, momentarily transparent, then resolidified as if nothing had happened. The buckshot had passed through him and embedded itself in the far wall, splintering the wooden boards. "Mortal weapons cannot harm me," the colonel said mildly, inspecting his uniform as if checking for damage despite the shotgun's obvious ineffectiveness. "I've come from beyond the veil to reclaim what's mine." The twins whimpered in unison, pressing closer together on the bed, their hands still joined as if they drew strength from the connection. Their faces were pale but resolute, fear mingled with a determination that seemed too adult for their young features. "You killed them once," Dr. Caldwell said, finding her voice at last. She stood her ground despite the supernatural horror before her, her scientific training forgotten in the face of a threat to children under her care. "Isn't that enough?" The colonel's face darkened, the unnatural fire in his eyes flaring brighter. "They defied me, tried to flee to the enemy, betrayed their heritage." His gaze shifted to the twins, contempt mingled with possessive rage. "And now they've cheated their punishment by stealing new bodies, new lives. Such disobedience cannot stand." "They're just children," Martha pleaded from her corner, finding courage in her maternal instinct despite her terror. "They are traitors," the colonel spat, his refined accent slipping as emotion overcame decorum. "Tainted by slave blood, a constant reminder of my wife's betrayal." His voice softened momentarily, a flash of genuine grief crossing his harsh features. "I did love her, even after her indiscretion. I gave her a Christian burial, a fine headstone. And you murdered her children," Dr. Pierce accused, moving to stand beside Thomas, the two men forming a barrier between the supernatural intruder and the rest of the room's occupants. The colonel's face twisted in rage. "I cleansed my family's honor in fire." He turned back to the twins, his expression settling into cold determination. "And I'll do it again." As he spoke, the oil lamp on the bedside table flared unnaturally bright, its flame leaping up toward the curtains. The small flame should not have been enough to ignite the rain-dampened fabric, but it caught immediately, spreading with unnatural speed. "No!" Thomas lunged forward, trying to knock the lamp away, but an invisible force threw him back against the wall with bone-jarring force. He slumped to the floor, momentarily stunned by the impact. The fire spread with unnatural speed, racing up the curtains and across the ceiling as if the air itself were combustible. In seconds, the bedroom door was blocked by flames, cutting off their escape route. The heat was intense, sweat immediately beating on their skin despite the cool rain still audible outside. "We have to get out through the window," Dr. Caldwell shouted, already moving to open it. The rain might make climbing difficult, but a wet descent was preferable to burning alive. Martha, recovering from her paralysis, grabbed the twins, trying to pull them from the bed toward the potential escape route. But the boys remained still, staring at the colonel with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. Their posture had changed subtly back straighter, chins lifted, looking less like frightened children and more like young men facing an enemy. "You can't have us again," Elijah said, his voice stronger than it had any right to be, with a resonance that seemed to come from a larger, older body. "We didn't come back just to die the same way," Emmett added, the same unchildlike strength in his tone. The colonel laughed, a chilling sound above the roar of the flames. "You have no choice. Your souls are forfeit to me. A father's authority extends beyond death itself." Dr. Pierce, coughing in the thickening smoke, noticed something odd. While the fire spread rapidly around the edges of the room, consuming the curtains, the wallpaper, and now the wooden floorboards near the door, it seemed to curve around the twins themselves, as if some invisible barrier protected them. The flames approached their bed, but then bent away, like water flowing around a stone in a stream. The colonel noticed it too, his confident expression faltering. "What trickery is this?" No trickery, the twins said in unison, their voices blending into something that sounded older, deeper. A voice that might have belonged to the young men they had been in their previous life. Just truth. They stood up on the bed, still holding hands, their small figures somehow seeming taller, more substantial in the flickering firelight. The white cotton of their nightshirts gleamed against the darkness, untouched by the smoke that was rapidly filling the room. We remembered everything, Elijah said, his eyes never leaving the colonel's face. Including what Mother taught us before she died, Emmett continued, matching his brother's unwavering gaze. The colonel's face contorted with rage, and beneath it, something that looked remarkably like fear. Adelaide taught you nothing. She was gone before you could walk. She left us her book, the twins said together. The one you never found. The one that told us who we really were. What are they talking about? Martha cried, coughing violently in the smoke. She had retreated to the window where Dr. Caldwell was frantically trying to fashion an escape route, tying bed sheets together to form a makeshift rope. Dr. Caldwell, who had managed to open the window but found the drop too far for safety without assistance, turned back to the bizarre confrontation unfolding in the burning room. Some kind of family secret, I think. The fire had now spread to every part of the room except the small island where the twins stood. Thomas had recovered enough to pull Martha toward the window, and Dr. Pierce was attempting to help Dr. Caldwell with the bed-sheet rope. But all of them kept glancing back at the supernatural standoff taking place in the center of the inferno. "We have to get them out," Thomas shouted above the roar of the flames, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "They won't come," Dr. Caldwell realized, watching the twins face their tormentor. "Not until this is finished." The colonel advanced on the children, his form seeming to grow larger, more menacing. The flames bent toward him as if drawn by his presence, wreathing his figure without consuming it. "You are nothing but the spawn of a slave and an unfaithful wife. You have no power over me." "Our father wasn't just any slave," Elijah said, his voice eerily calm amid the chaos of the burning room. "He was a conjure man from Haiti," Emmett continued, using a term familiar in Southern folklore for practitioners of voodoo. "Mother wrote it all down, and we have his blood." They finished together. As they spoke, they pulled at the collars of their nightshirts, revealing the crescent-shaped scars on their left shoulders. In the firelight, the old wounds seemed to glow with an inner light, not red like the flames surrounding them, but a cool blue-white radiance that cast strange shadows on their young faces. "No," the colonel whispered, taking a step back for the first time since his appearance. His supernatural confidence seemed to waver in the face of this unexpected development. "It's not possible. You marked us to own us," Elijah said, his voice carrying easily over the roar of the flames. "But the marks connect us instead," Emmett added, his gaze never leaving the colonel's face. "To each other," they said in unison, their linked hands glowing with the same blue-white light that emanated from their scars. "And to him," Elijah continued, his free hand reaching toward the ceiling as if in supplication or summoning. "Our real father," Emmett finished, mirroring his brother's gesture. The colonel's form flickered again, like a photograph blurring at the edges. His substance seemed less solid now, portions of his uniform becoming transparent before solidifying again. "Lies," he hissed, but his voice had lost its commanding tone, acquiring instead the desperation of one who sees control slipping away. "African superstition, nothing more." Outside, the storm had intensified. Lightning struck so close to the house that the thunder came simultaneously with the flash, rattling the windows in their frames. The rain beat against the glass with renewed fury, as if nature itself was responding to the supernatural confrontation within. "You burned us once," the the twins acknowledged, their voices blending into something older, deeper. A voice that might have belonged to young men on the cusp of adulthood rather than children. But fire cleanses as well as destroys. As they spoke, the flames around the room seemed to change direction, no longer spreading outward but pulling inward toward the colonel. The fire's color shifted too, from orange-red to the same blue-white that glowed from the twin scars. The colonel's translucent form began to glow from within, as if the fire were consuming him from the inside. "This isn't possible," he gasped, looking down at his dissolving hands in horror. Where the blue-white fire touched, his form disintegrated like paper burning from the edges inward. "You're just children, helpless children." "We were," the twins agreed, their faces serene despite the inferno surrounding them. "But not anymore." The colonel's form erupted in flames, becoming a pillar of fire that twisted and writhed in agony. His scream wasn't human. A high, keening wail that made everyone in the room cover their ears in pain. The sound seemed to contain decades of rage and hatred, but also fear, the fear of final dissolution, of a spirit forced from the world it had clung to through sheer malevolent will. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural fire vanished. The colonel was gone, leaving not even ash behind to mark his passing. And with him, the flames that had been consuming the bedroom disappeared as well. One moment the room was an inferno, the next everything was untouched. The curtains whole, the wallpaper unmarked, even the oil lamp burning with its normal steady flame. The only evidence that anything unusual had happened was the acrid smell of smoke that lingered in the air and the expressions of stunned disbelief on the faces of the adults who had witnessed the impossible. The twins collapsed onto the bed, suddenly looking like ordinary, exhausted children. Their small bodies seemed to deflate, the unnatural strength that had sustained them during the confrontation draining away to leave only two vulnerable boys, their faces pale and drawn in the lamplight. "It's over," Elijah whispered, his voice once again that of a child. "He's gone for good," Emmett added, his eyes drifting closed with fatigue. The adults stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The room was intact, no fire damage, no broken glass, no sign of the violent confrontation that had seemed to threaten their very lives moments before. Yet the memory of it was vivid in their minds, too detailed and consistent across all four witnesses to be dismissed as hallucination. It was Dr. Caldwell who recovered first, her scientific mind already trying to rationalize the impossible events, to fit them into some framework that would allow her to maintain her understanding of the world. "Mass hallucination," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "Induced by suggestion and fear, perhaps triggered by the electrical activity of the storm affecting our brain's temporal lobes." But her voice lacked conviction, trailing off as she looked at the twins, who had fallen back against their pillows in evident exhaustion. Their scars were still visible where their nightshirts had been pulled aside, but the strange blue-white glow had faded, leaving only the familiar crescent marks that had been present since birth. Dr. Pierce helped the twins lie back properly on their pillows, his physician's instincts taking over despite his scientific bewilderment. They looked pale and drained, their skin clammy to the touch, their breathing rapid but gradually slowing to a more normal rhythm. "Are you boys all right?" he asked gently, checking their pulses with a practiced touch. They nodded weakly. "Just tired," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It takes a lot of strength to send a spirit back," Emmett explained, his eyelids drooping with exhaustion. "That's what Mother's book said." Before Dr. Pierce could ask what book they meant, Martha pushed past him to sit on the edge of the bed, gathering both boys into her arms. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression was one of fierce maternal love rather than fear. "I don't understand what happened here tonight," she said shakily, rocking slightly as she held them. "And I don't rightly care. You're my sons, no matter who you might have been before. Do you hear me? My sons." Thomas joined them, sitting on the other side of the bed and placing one large, calloused hand on each boy's head in a gesture of blessing and protection. "That's right. You're Blackwoods now, and Blackwoods stick together. Whatever happened before, whatever memories you carry, that's past. This is your life now with us." The twins looked up at them with tired but grateful eyes. "We know," they said together, their voices soft with affection. Then Elijah added, "You're our real parents now. And we're not going anywhere," Emmett promised, reaching out to take his mother's hand. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Caldwell exchanged glances, silently agreeing to withdraw and give the family this moment of reconnection. Whatever scientific or supernatural explanation might eventually be found for the night's events, one thing was clear: the bonds of love between the Blackwoods transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death, of past and present. They slipped quietly from the room, leaving the family huddled together on the bed, their forms illuminated by the gentle glow of the lamp, a circle of warmth and belonging in a world where mysteries far greater than science could explain had briefly broken through. In the days that followed, the doctors struggled to make sense of what they had witnessed. Dr. Caldwell, unable to reconcile the events with her scientific worldview, eventually convinced herself that exhaustion and suggestion had created a shared delusion. The alternative, accepting that spirits could return from beyond death, that reincarnation was real, that children might carry memories and even physical marks from previous existences, was too radical a revision of her understanding of reality. She returned to Baltimore and never published anything about the case, though the experience influenced her work with traumatized children for the remainder of her career. She became known for her unusually open-minded approach to childhood psychological phenomena, for listening without judgment to even the strangest accounts from her young patients. Dr. Pierce was less able to dismiss what he had seen. He remained in Creswell County, continuing to document the twins' development with the permission of the Blackwoods. To his amazement, their past life memories began to fade rapidly after that stormy night, as if a burden had been lifted from their young minds. Where once they had spoken constantly of Willow Creek Plantation, of Adelaide and the Colonel, of events from the 1860s, they now focused on the present, on school, on farm chores, on the normal activities of children their age. They still occasionally mentioned their other mother, but with decreasing frequency as the months passed, and always with a sense of peaceful remembrance rather than longing or distress. By their 13th birthday, a milestone the original Harlan twins had never reached, Elijah and Emmett Blackwood were, to all appearances, normal boys. They still finished each other's sentences occasionally and seemed to communicate without words, but these were traits many twins shared. The only remaining sign of their strange history was the crescent-shaped scars on their shoulders, which never faded. Dr. Pierce documented it all, filling notebook after notebook with observations and theories. He corresponded with researchers interested in reincarnation and paranormal phenomena, though he was careful to protect the Blackwoods' privacy, never revealing their real names or location. His meticulous records would eventually form the basis for a carefully anonymized case study published in a small academic journal dedicated to unexplained psychological phenomena, a publication largely ignored by the mainstream scientific community but treasured by those with more eclectic interests. As for the Blackwood family, they rarely spoke of the events of that summer. Thomas and Martha raised their sons with love and patience, teaching them to farm the land as generations of Blackwoods had done before them. If they sometimes caught the twins standing by their bedroom window at night, staring at the distant hills where Willow Creek Plantation had once stood, they never mentioned it. They did, however, take the boys to visit Adelaide's grave once a year on her birthday. They would bring wildflowers, Martha's idea, after hearing the twins describe their Sunday ritual from their previous life. They would stand quietly while the boys placed the flowers at the base of the simple headstone, and then they would return home, the past acknowledged but not allowed to overshadow the present. Life in rural Kentucky continued its steady rhythm through the seasons. Model T Fords became more common on the county roads. Radio sets appeared in farmhouse parlors. The Great War ended and Prohibition began. Through it all, the Blackwood twins grew into fine young men who would eventually have families of their own. They never again spoke of Colonel Harland or their fiery death in a previous life. But sometimes in their dreams, they would see a beautiful woman with hair piled high in swishing skirts who looked at them with love and whispered, "Well done, my brave boys. Well done." And they would wake with tears on their cheeks but peace in their hearts, knowing they had finally laid the past to rest. As they grew older, the twins gradually drifted apart, as siblings often do. Elijah stayed in Creswell County, taking over the family farm after Thomas's death in 1941. He married a local girl, had 4 children, and lived a quiet, respectable life as a pillar of the community. He served as a deacon in the Methodist Church, was known for his fair dealing at the farmers market, and never missed a county fair where his tobacco routinely won blue ribbons. Emmett, always the more adventurous of the two, moved to Louisville after graduating high school. He worked in a factory during World War II, then used the GI Bill to attend college, the first Blackwood to do so. He became a history teacher specializing in Civil War studies, though he never shared with his colleagues or students the personal connection he felt to the era. He married later in life, had 2 daughters, and visited his twin and their mother in Creswell County every Christmas and 4th of July. The brothers maintained their special connection despite the physical distance between them. Each would know when the other was ill or troubled, feeling phantom pains when his twin was injured, waking from sleep with certainty that his brother needed him. More than once, one brother arrived unexpectedly at the other's door, having felt an inexplicable urge to visit, only to find his twin facing some crisis that required support. And always the crescent-shaped scars remained, a physical reminder of an experience that had shaped their lives in ways that went beyond the ordinary bonds of family or the typical development of identity. In 1973, when the twins were 50, Dr. Samuel Pierce died peacefully in his sleep, his decades of notes on their case stored carefully in his office. Among his personal effects was a sealed envelope addressed to Elijah and Emmett Blackwood, to be delivered after his death. Inside was a brief letter explaining that he had donated all his research materials to the Department of Parapsychology at Duke University, with the stipulation that the Blackwoods' real identities be protected. "Your case," he wrote, "may someday help science understand the true nature of human consciousness and its potential continuity beyond a single lifetime. You have my eternal gratitude for allowing me to document your extraordinary journey, and my deepest admiration for the courage with which you faced your past and built your future." The twins read the letter together on Elijah's front porch, surrounded by the same Kentucky hills that had witnessed their rebirth 7 decades earlier. They didn't speak about it afterward, simply folding the letter back into its envelope and returning to their discussion of more mundane matters: Emmett's upcoming retirement, Elijah's newest grandchild, the rising price of feed for the dairy cows. But that night, after Emmett had gone to bed in the same room he had shared with his brother as a child, Elijah stood at the window, looking out toward where Willow Creek Plantation had once stood. The land had been subdivided and developed over the years, with new houses and businesses replacing the once grand estate. Only the small cemetery remained, protected by historical preservation laws. "We did it, Billy," he whispered, using the name his twin had carried in their previous life. "We lived the lives we were meant to have." And somewhere in the gentle Kentucky night, he thought he heard Adelaide's voice carried on the summer breeze, saying, "My brave, brave boys." Years later, in 1972, an archaeology student from the University of Kentucky would discover something curious while excavating the ruins of Willow Creek Plantation. In what had once been a child's bedroom, buried beneath decades of soil and debris, lay a small leather-bound book. Its pages, miraculously preserved inside a metal box hidden beneath a floorboard, contained the diary of Adelaide Harland. The diary included her secret marriage to a Haitian slave named Samuel before her arranged marriage to the colonel, and her fears for her twin sons after her death. The final entry, dated just days before she died from childbed fever, read, "My dear boys, if you are reading this, know that your true father was not just a slave, but a powerful man in his homeland. His blood runs in your veins, and with it his strength. The colonel may mark your flesh, but he cannot claim your spirits. Remember this, my sons, fire destroys, but it also purifies. When the time comes, do not fear the flames." The student would publish his findings in an obscure academic journal, unaware that in a small cemetery not far from the excavation site, the shared gravestone of Jackson and William Harlan Jr. had cracked down the middle on the same night in 1923, when the Blackwood farmhouse was briefly engulfed in supernatural flames. Some mysteries are not meant to be fully understood, only witnessed and remembered. And in the gentle hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to the hollows like forgotten memories, the story of the Blackwood twins is still whispered on summer evenings when the fireflies dance and the past seems as close as a heartbeat.